Kyle Thompson.
And I'm Tina Sikka.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. This week we are back with Tina Sikka, returning guest, to talk about her new book, Climate Technology, Gender and Justice, The Standpoint of the Vulnerable. Tina, what's this book all about?
It is a feminist sort of analysis of geoengineering using feminist science studies. So I apply a feminist empiricism to examine some of the assumptions around the science surrounding climate geoengineering.
I just wanted to say congratulations on finishing this book. It is like a full book-length project, a thorough analysis.
Yeah, it took a good chunk of time to kind of write and then edit and make sure the science was all, copacetic and everything, and then the entire publishing process. So it's been a while in the making, but I'm excited it finally came out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was in the making back when we had you on the show last year, almost a year ago. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And for any listeners that are following along, this is very much a continuation of the work from that episode. I guess one sort of way to kick off the conversation here is to ask, why did you feel that this work needed to be done and needed to be published? That's not a dig. No, that's just an invitation for discussion.
Well, the conversations around, climate change sort of ramping up in the political climate in the States and the denialism and just sort of the kind of frenzy around climate change as a sociological phenomenon, as a scientific artifact, as an interdisciplinary site of study. I just, sort of looking at the science around climate change and some of the solutions, and then that kind of paired with my interest in feminist science studies, or this general critique of scientific practice as problematic in the sense of gender, but going beyond the issue of pipeline and women in STEM and just the kind of liberal feminist critique of science, and trying to get towards a kind of feminist examination of science that looked at the assumptions and the values and the presuppositions behind it, and looked at different ways that we could do science. And I thought it would be interesting to kind of pair the two and try to see if there were spaces in which we could critique scientific practice, use it with a gendered analysis, and not open the door to denialism, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's very important to, I think about these issues in the way that you have, because the critiques that you bring up certainly ring true, especially when you get into the concrete examples in the book of how science is done and where these perspectives have value in critiquing that methodology. But it never, in reading the book, you never get to that point of sort of being well, it's all just opinion, and it's all just sort of these language games that are played among scientists and don't really have any kind of broader validity beyond that. That's quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, it was a concern for me in trying to find a approach to science rooted in feminist praxis that pulled on and tried to, probe the presuppositions, but did so in a way that didn't lead to relativism. And so, I go through some other frameworks as well, and, critique ecofeminism and these other perspectives. It was funny, I actually last year was in Edinburgh for a conference, and I presented, and there were two people. It was a sort of risk communication and science conference, and there were two like a father-son team who was there to kind of push the climate denialism factor. And they came to my talk, and, you know, later on, I sort of found out that they thought maybe they had found a colleague or a comrade in their denialism, and they were quite disappointed in the talk.
Yeah. Just kind of following on from that, like, I mean, it's sort of very interesting in your book that, like, this is a pretty scathing sort of critique of the state of climate science as it stands, or just like as the state of science as it stands. But it definitely holds open the possibility of alternatives. And in fact, in many cases, the whole framing is, like, we're looking for an alternative way of doing science, not a sort of way of doing anti-science.
Yeah, and I like Helen Longino, who's the scholar, the academic that I pull from, where she's saying, you know, not doing a feminine science, but doing science as a feminist. And so it's this sort of idea that not that there is something essentialist or some kind of feminine characteristic that can be applied to science, but it's this idea that given the life experiences, socialization processes, the sort of life histories of women, that there are different perspectives to bear, and ones that are rooted in the experience of being a woman and having this sort of gendered existence. And so it's harnessing that experience to change science, not that there is something characteristically universal about what that might be, but it's that, you know, you are doing science as a feminist, and that kind of political activity that feminists have engaged in can be harnessed to examine science.
Yeah, and it seems like, drawing on Longino, you really focus in on this idea of sort of scientific virtues, feminist scientific virtues, as an approach for kind of rethinking methodology. I thought that was quite a interesting approach in itself.
Yeah, I really like the way that she kind of takes Thomas Kuhn's values around, you know, accuracy and simplicity and fruitfulness and all that sort of thing, and says that, okay, those are values that are brought to science, and what are some feminist values? And then she juxtaposes those with, you know, her novelty, heterogeneity, focus on human needs, diffusion of power, and so it's trying to develop this parallel, but saying it's complementary. And the only one that overlaps is the empirical adequacy.
Right. Yeah. And I found it quite interesting as like somebody who studied some of the sort of philosophy of science and historian of science people that came before Kuhn, and kind of laid the groundwork for his work, because it really sounds like these values that you're espousing, or Longino's espousing, have a lot more kind of consonance with that interwar generation of like socialist science people, like from Vienna and so on, creating the Encyclopedia of Science. It's like these kinds of ideas about being more context aware, having more pluralism, all that kind of stuff. It really seemed to resonate with that like earlier generation of philosophy of science people that were kind of suppressed in the as a result of the Cold War. Yeah.
So just to sort of nail it down a little bit more for the listeners, could you give us a rundown of Longino's ideas? I believe this is what's referred to as feminist contextual empiricism.
Yeah, so feminist contextual empiricism is really, it's a model, sort of a two-part model, where Longino is trying to rethink scientific practice. And she focuses on rearticulating values around science, and then also developing a model of truth in science that is consensus-based. So her perspective, you know, in kind of complementing Kuhn's notions of good theory. It's broad scope, fruitful, simple, consistent, and accurate. She talks about empirical adequacy as the first kind of epistemic virtue. And there she's trying to say that there has to be an empirical sort of an adequate fit between theory and observation, that it has to be falsifiable, testable, rooted in traditional scientific practice in a way. And then she says it needs to be novel, which is something that traditional science tends to give short shrift to. So not conservative in highlighting marginal findings and approaches. Heterogeneous, which I know we'll talk about, but that's sort of this idea that the theory doesn't have to be unified. It can be multi-causal. There's, a traditional focus on one-to-one causality. Mutual interaction, that theories are kind of complex, interconnected, that kind of network model of science, and human needs is another one, where science as a kind of platform on which to do things and the kind of questions we ask need to be really oriented towards hunger and privation. It's kind of a pragmatic value. And then her diffusion of power one leads right into her second part of the model, which is really about this idea that truth is based in consensus, and we need to have room and spaces for conversations around science where that's responsive to criticism, intellectual authority is equally dispersed, more voices are brought in, and that whatever comes out of those community, kind of scientific community spaces that are inclusive is what counts as truthful science, and that is objective in a very robust way.
Yeah, and and in particular, you're sort of leveraging this onto the contemporary climate science, and it's that the way that climate science is being done right now, especially around notions of geoengineering and using sulfur dioxide to block out the sun and that sort of stuff, doesn't display any of these characteristics, right? And is deficient in that way.
Yeah, the only one that I sort of, in passing say that, represents a kind of virtue is the novelty, and it's not novelty substantively, it's sort of a superficial novelty and just being like an out-of-the-box kind of solution. Right. But one that has very, very problematic assumptions built around it, and ones that are really about, not adequately considering the experience of marginalization and climate change, which is, something that the science and the modeling, the actual scientific practice itself is just not engaged in.
Mm-hmm, sure. And you're augmenting the feminist contextual empiricism with feminist standpoint theory and technofeminism. Could you give us a little bit of a rundown of what you're picking from those to build up your sort of lens that you're looking at the whole thing through?
Yeah, so I do. It's funny when I was writing it, and when I kind of did the research on the different approaches to feminist analysis, I still like reading the feminist standpoint theory and the techno-feminism, even though particularly standpoint theory I've got some issues with, because standpoint theory it kind of, it does a lot of what the feminist empiricism does, but it doesn't hold too fast to the empirical adequacy. So it's this idea that critiquing feminist empiricism is being too positivist and too androcentric. And it's this idea that the marginalized perspective, whether it's one from like a post-colonial or a feminist or a experience of race, that it in and of itself is superior, that it will produce better knowledge, that kind of science from below perspective. And I like, Sandra Harding and Donna Haraway I think Cassandra Harding has this example of Indigenous women and their knowledge around fishing practices, and there was an example of problems in fish stocks being solved by Indigenous women who had sort of superior knowledge of the way that fishing stocks were dwindling, and so they had this sort of solution that worked really well. And so it's this perspective that Indigenous knowledge, theoretical, kind of more embodied approaches to science, actually, from a position of marginalization specifically, leads to better science. Mm-hmm. And I kind of, I have sympathy with that approach, that idea that, maybe the empiricism that Longino holds to, what would happen if we challenged that? Mm-hmm. And so I think asking those questions are really important. And then the techno-feminism, I think, can contribute as well, because it focuses on design, and this idea that technology is a source and consequence of gender relations, and that they're co-constituted. So, gender is reflected in the design of the technology, and then society kind of feeds into that. And that one of the ways that we can sort of challenge, a kind of masculinist, very Western-oriented approach to science is through practices that look at the design. So the material level as well as the discursive level, and that's something that's often missing in some of the feminist contextual empiricism. So this idea of the design, that there are values embedded in the infrastructure of the technology that can be challenged and then maybe re-articulated in ways that are pro-social and that are more egalitarian.
Yeah, and I mean, that last point in particular seems to be, very much similar to what we talked about in our discussion of Feinberg's transforming technology.
Yeah, there's a lot of resonance with I think, well, with this show, right? It has an orbit around all these little bodies, right? And there's resonance between all of them. Like, that definitely resonates with Feinberg. It resonates with, say, Accelerate, or even the work like the cybernetic brain with Pickering. This idea that, like, the technoscience could be so much more, but it's sort of shackled to this very restricted mindset and view of the world that keeps it restricted to one perspective, a privileged perspective that directs everything.
Yeah, and I was actually introduced years ago in that class that we took on with Feinberg, where we started to read Judy Wackman.
Right.
And that kind of was one of the areas where I was like, oh, and the way that kind of had a synergy with Feinberg's approach to the way that he, studies the internet. It's a design issue in some ways. And so that's really where I pulled a lot of it from.
Yeah, and I think it's very fruitful when you look at something like geoengineering to consider how the sort of ongoing process of gendering happens in the design and articulation of the perspectives, of the methodology, of the design, all those levels. It's really interesting. Mm-hmm.
So, Tina, could you give us because I'm kind of aware that some of the listeners, or probably a lot of the listeners, won't really be totally familiar with this kind of discourse. Can you give us some examples of how that shakes out in geoengineering specifically?
You mean the different ways of kind of doing it?
Well, I guess maybe firstly the deficiencies of the current approach and the ways in which it screws up in not considering more of the world, and then these sort of alternative proposals.
Yeah. So one of the ways that I kind of think about it and write about it in the text, there's some concrete examples that you can kind of question, like, why is carbon dioxide the control? In most of geoengineering modeling, it only tests, if we're going to use geoengineering, how much does CO2 go up? How much does CO2 go down? What about, other greenhouse gases? nitrous dioxide, methane. None of those are counted in any of the models. There's also this idea that the baseline of 280 parts per million sort of says that, all the problems started when it assumes all the problems started with the Industrial Revolution. There's a lot of evidence to show that, deforestation, early agriculture, livestock, that's where it really started. And that, draws out a lot of considerations on, that is actually, those are the practices that are the problem. It was this kind of, large scale intrusion into the natural environment. Another one is, the politics of scale, where the science always focuses on figuring out temperature that is averaged across the globe. And so there's this idea, okay, if there is a decrease in temperature overall, fine, but what about specific regions? Whenever you do see any science that shows a focus on kind of more localized effects, it's always the areas with, very poor populations with a lot of deprivation that are going to bear the brunt of the negative consequences. Mm-hmm. And so, those choices are really problematic, and I argue that those are really based on values of Western science that can be changed.
Yeah, and that's the all of that. There is the sort of it's discussed a lot in Chapter 4, right? Ontological heterogeneity, which I found was a fascinating chapter. And so the core of the problem here is that the mainstream science or Western science or patriarchal science, whatever, kind of has values this kind of ontological homogeneity, and like values abstractions and unities and singularities, and that valuing of those things then erases difference and specificity and heterogeneous collections of objects that don't fit together well and don't fit together smoothly. But in the face of that challenge, what the mainstream science does is it just chucks it all in the bin and pretends it doesn't exist, right?
Yeah, and it's almost this, when you kind of say it all together and you list all of these things, another one is why isn't there a kind of more parsing of the economic sectors and, mm-hmm. The different responsibilities of rich and poor countries mm-hmm. in reducing these climate emissions? Nothing like that is discussed, and it when you list it all, it almost makes you feel like, it's intentional, because it allows us not to ask those very important questions about marginalization and vulnerability that is produced by the system that, we are trying to correct by the same strategies that made the problems in the first place.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's really where I think there's this value to bringing in the perspective of ontology, because you kind of when I first looked at sort of the chapter heading here, I was like, okay, well, ontological heterogeneity, just sort of this ontology that is more pluralistic and thinks about the variety of things in the world, is something we really saw a lot in our discussion of the cybernetic brain. But how does this apply to climate science? And it's actually when, you make that leap from here's the ontological perspective of valuing pluralism, and then looking at these specific cases of how science is done, where it's in a very specific and concrete sense, the practice of science is just narrowing down the number of variables they consider as relevant, and that leads to a more narrow perspective on how to address the problems that are identified through the science. So, it's really just this kind of ontological poverty is leading to impoverished solutions.
I like that one, ontological poverty. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
yeah. No, and you know, even something as fundamental as model disagreement. You know, the fact that there is a lot. One of the areas in climate and geoengineering, particularly the approach that I'm looking at, there's a lot of model disagreement on Antarctic sea ice, and what different models have different results, and if we do institute geoengineering, this will happen, or X will happen, or Y will happen. So there's model disagreement, and I sort of make the argument that is sort of seen as an ancillary part of the science, or like on this one issue there is model disagreement, but a feminist approach would sort of say that disagreement is important, and it doesn't mean that necessarily the science has succeeded or failed. It just means that there is disagreement, and now we have to think in a very creative way to maybe examine why that is, or what's happening, and sort of sit with that. Yeah,
we have to become comfortable with the world, right, as it actually is, and rather than become comfortable with these sort of frankly crazed fantasies of like simplistic, linear, unidirectional sort of forces and so on. Like when it's laid, it had so much resonance with what we read in Feenberg and the kind of cybernetic ontology there. But like again, when you laid it out on the page here, it just really sank in. It's like, yeah, the way science is done, or the way the world is thought of, is bizarre, frankly.
Mm-hmm. It is, and there's some interesting work in things like paleoecology, and we're in you're relying maybe on local data sets and models, and paleo ecology does this interesting thing where it looks at biodiversity as the core lens through which to study climate science and to gauge how it's changed. And so it's this idea that, okay, maybe we can look at fossils and sort of look at a more anthropological approach to our changing climate. Would that yield different results? And so, that's one of the ways that, I think would be really like nonlinear methods, tacit practice, ethnographies, field work. Like there's so many alternatives that are rooted in feminist practice, but even go beyond it. Where chaos and dynamism is kind of incorporated, that I think aesthetics as well. Like one of the really interesting things of the solar radiation management geoengineering is that one of the side effects will be that the skies will be white, so no more blue skies. And so it's this like, what are the aesthetic consequences of that? What would that change to the kind of felt humanity of people? And I think that that is a question that is really interesting also.
Yeah. So there's one. I'm kind of again aware of the listeners that it might be hard to kind of grasp onto the particulars of this discussion, but you have this good example here of like how the traditional view of the world, traditional ontology, leads people to believe in this kind of like or this mistake about the process of egg fertilization. Can you maybe talk us through the founding kind of assumptions that lead to this really bad conclusion, or this sort of bad understanding of how fertilization works?
Okay, yeah. It's actually an example that Longino talks about. You're talking about like actual conception, right?
The monocausal thought pattern leading to this really weird understanding of how conception works. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's this. That's where a lot of the examination of discourse and rhetoric comes in. It's built into the way we talk about science. It's very gendered, and so in kind of reproductive science, we have these very common tropes, and it's in scientific textbooks. Like it's always about the sperm and the egg, where you have the active sperm and the passive egg, which really mirrors that kind of gender ideology in real life, the active man and the passive woman. And so you get that, replicated in the wider cultural discourse. And I always think about, like, do you remember that the beginning part of the movie Look Who's Talking?
Oh yeah.
Where like the sperm and the egg, and the egg is inert, it's passive, it's not changing, and then you have the sperm sort of fighting its way to get there. That's a very gendered way in which science permeates into our larger culture of women as passive and men as active. And so there are other readings of the way, and people have gone, feminist scientists have gone back and sort of looked at the process itself and created these alternative tellings of the egg as active. Really compelling scientific evidence to show, that there is a kind of active, but then you're kind of reproducing the binary in a way. So now there's attempts to kind of go beyond why we binarize the active and the passive. And so I think that's a really interesting, there's been a lot of this work in biology. Not a lot in the empirical sciences. Agnes Kovacs has done some interesting feminist analysis of the assumptions around gases, like, in sort of chemistry. And there's also some work being done on feminist physics. So yeah, I mean, doing that kind of analysis in the hard sciences is much more difficult.
Yeah, and like the root of the problem here is this, one of the roots of the problem is this like binary stratified kind of thinking. That's the sort of default, which actually hinders our understanding of the world, because the world is not made up of binaries. It's made up of these messy, detailed, reciprocal, resonant processes where the multiple actors involved kind of draw each other together and in some ways cause each other, and so on. And it's like, I think it's an objection you'll sometimes get from the sort of the ignorant is like, well, what would a feminist physics be? You're trying to change the world to be feminist or something. But no, it's that the world itself is ontologically rich in a way that our present sort of masculinist way of doing things cannot grapple with. And so when it can't grapple with things, it just erases them and pretends they're not there. And so what we're proposing here is a much richer and more effective kind of physics, right, as a feminist physics.
Yeah, where we're talking about it as a feminism as a set of strategies, like rooted in practice and rooted in, material experience, and that it's, the kind of tactics and perspectives that have been garnered from feminism, as a kind of social praxis that can be harnessed to rethink some of our other knowledge production practices, and that is what's feminist, not that, we're going to infuse science with stereotypically feminine principles.
Right. Yes. And I mean, that really comes through in the sort of readings and critiques that you find, or that you've provided in this book, that it is those strategies that are at the core here. And those can really help to sort of shake up and reconsider fundamental assumptions about what counts as evidence, what does not count as evidence, and what kind of approach should we take in thinking about these big problems. So yeah, I found that to be really, like, I don't know, just very refreshing and quite, I guess, novel to my experience. That's like, oh yeah, like you can take these kinds of like insights from feminist practice and move them into other domains of life that you wouldn't really think of right away.
Yeah, I actually did a series of lectures in the medical school at Newcastle University where I teach. And so there was one particular lecture in which I was talking about feminist approaches to science in medicine. And, there was this one person who just would not agree with, it. And it kept on going back to the idea that I was making an argument for more feminine science, and would say, well, the principles that you're articulating, doesn't that just mean good science? And I, kept on going back to the fact that yes, but that's not how science is practiced, and sort of going through, the actual fundamental structures of science, in a Kuhnian sense, in a sort of big science sense, in an empirical sense, and that that's much different from the way that the model that I'm putting forth, and it was just this like cognitive leap we could not take.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's like that would be good science exactly if it were actually in practice. But my argument is that it's not being practiced precisely. Wow. Yeah. Yeah,
and it's actually not. It's not in keeping with the principles and values that exist behind the science now. Like, it's just those are not representative or in the science at all. And he also would not accept, or was kind of startled by, the argument that there was no genetic component to race, and he was a biochemist. So it was this, like, I was just like,
so like that's very interesting, right? In that, like, I mean, I've sort of been in technology and the sciences and around and adjacent to these kind of orbits for a while, and like that's definitely a thing, right? Like the mainstream sort of ideology is like that. The practitioners regard themselves as being very curious and open and like honest and intellectually honest and so on, but like a kind of sober analysis, I think, reveals that that's almost never the case. There's a lot of ideological distortion going on in the sciences.
And absolutely, and I'm actually kind of looking at different, areas in which I can apply feminist science studies, and looking at nutrition and race as well. And so looking at how, genetic-based arguments are working within the health industry, that, there's a component in our genes that, make it so that we can have personalized diets that are, based on our DNA, and one component of that. And one of the ways in which we create populations is through markers of race and ancestry, which don't really map onto any sort of reality. It's used as a proxy. Right. It kind of reifies race. And so I'm looking at feminist science to critique that science as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I found sort of for myself, like this point that you bring up of the monocausal pattern of thought that treats apparently different entities as versions of a standard or paradigmatic member of the domain, wherein differences are regarded as eliminable. So you take this exemplar and just kind of erase the differences that are maybe or maybe not apparent, depending on your standpoint, depending on your perspective, in order to come up with this kind of elegant, abstracted model of what you're working with. As much as I've run into frustration with this kind of problem myself in academia, trying to express things that don't conform to accepted standards, or as much as we've talked about this on the show, just having that like statement in this book really did make me think hard about like the degree to which those practices are still really deeply ingrained in my own thinking. And that was really kind of an eye-opener and really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's this idea that the heterogeneous doesn't dilute scientific focus. And the way that the science is structured, that differences should be made marginal and eliminated is a tendency, and it's built into the science that we need to eliminate these small differences or big differences. And I think that is really bad scientific practice.
Mm-hmm. It is, yeah. And like, I mean, it's very hard. Like I've found it personally, actually, even in just sort of discourse with friends and colleagues and stuff, it can be very hard to get this sort of point across because like of this like pathological attachment to like elegance and these kind of notions, these kind of Platonic notions that like, I mean, I sort of ask people like, okay, a thought experiment here. What if with physics, when we finally get to the root, if we ever discover the root of reality and it turns out that the fundamental object in reality is disparity rather than unity, how would we ever deal with that? Mm-hmm. And they just sort of like stare blankly. It's like, I don't know. I think this is why I really appreciate the kind of metaphysics of like Deleuze, right, where foregrounding difference as the sort of engine of the universe, and then seeing the unities and the commonalities as a kind of like fantastical overlay, really. But of course, you know, in our contemporary age, we're stuck in the opposite, right, where the unities and the abstractions are the real thing, and the differences are just things to be erased, which is crazy. You know?
Yeah, and that is sort of interesting. My doctoral work was on sort of bringing into conversation Derrida and Habermas. And one of the things that really drew me to Derrida was this kind of fundamental rethinking of reality and language into one that is premised fundamentally on difference and what that looks like. And so that's translated into, you know, the work that I'm doing now. And I think, you know, even Longino's kind of the way she talks about the context of justification and how, and this idea of underdetermination of theory by data, that the data that you have, you know, when you do an experiment or you engage in kind of any scientific practice, you are going to have a case where there are multiple theories that are going to explain that data in equally plausible ways. Mm-hmm. And maybe our approach shouldn't be to now let's narrow it down and eliminate the, you know, find what's right. Maybe it should be at that very root of, you know, when we justify the science, you know, we need to start from there and say, how are we choosing theory? What are the values that are rooted, and why can't we stay with multiple explanations until we go through a very thorough process that's not rooted on kind of Western Enlightenment notions of science as universal?
Yeah, totally. And there's one little tiny bit here that I think I'd like to call out as like, it's a wonderful way of putting this, is that like we should see difference as a resource, not a failure, which I think is a really nice way of encapsulating the whole sentiment.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, that filters out into, you know, political conversations, you know, economic possibilities, cultural difference, you know, that kind of central way of looking at the world can you know, be transformative in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I've been thinking a lot in reading this text, you know, at the time of recording, the election is still going on in Alberta, and I've been kind of, you know, participating, trying to volunteer, talking to people, all that kind of thing. And, you know, one of the major issues, of course, here in Alberta, it's a, you know, major oil producer, is the extent to which politics should be guided by environmental science and climate science, because, you know, the positions of the parties, by and large, fall along a spectrum of the degree to which they want to take this seriously. You know, how much action is appropriate to curtail oil production, or how much should we restrict it? And there's a lot of communication problems there. But of course, you know, the problems are not limited simply to communication. There are class interests, there are material interests, that are kind of beyond the scope of polite discussion in terms of how they might be resolved. You go. I live near area that's quite bourgeois, and you just like walk up there and you talk to people when you're out canvassing, and they're not going to have a nuanced discussion with you about climate science. They just get very angry and shout at you and run you off their property. That is an existing problem. But that is.
Are you talking from experience?
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is personal experience. Like in the last 2 weeks of being yelled at, by some rather unpleasant people. But I think bringing in this perspective of viewing difference as a resource and sort of thinking pluralistically from a pluralistic ontology in the climate science, it may have something to contribute in terms of the problems of communication and the problems of articulation and thinking in politics, because I think we're still at a level where, even in the politics of the Green Party, which is a very minor party here, has no chance of getting elected, but, is participating. I think the environment or environmental issues are treated as a kind of specific domain of politics. And that kind of seems to me like it may be enforced by this focus on monocausality in environmental research. That the ontological limitations of the research is creating a kind of limited political ontology to go with it.
Yeah. And I find that, it was making me kind of think about a couple of things. One is, how different techniques are being used to ground climate science and sort of the whole notion of a disrupted climate based on activities that are human driven in the way that the Green New Deal has been articulated, where they're trying to connect the environment with like labor, like with a jobs guarantee, with a new kind of economic development, and that it seems like we're grasping for different ways to embed the climate in more easily discernible or easly graspable changes. And I think it's an interesting way to, let's ground it in labor. Let's ground it, and how about grounding it in sort of actual kind of socialist practice and praxis, and what would that look like? I think another way in which something like the 280 parts per million, I think the original notion was that it was meant to be a kind of boundary object, where it is an easily translatable baseline through which to tell the public, okay, look at this number, and then we can kind of show you in visually compelling and discursively compelling ways how it's changed. And that hasn't really worked.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really interesting, and that brings me back. The last thing that it made me think about is sort of the more citizen science work, where maybe we need to engage people in the science. And I know that Feinberg wrote a lot about the activities of the lay public in science around HIV/AIDS in the 90s,
right?
And how they changed the way that that medical trials were run, and you started to have the public involved in scientific conferences and taken seriously as actual contributors to knowledge. And you didn't have this bifurcation between the lay public and the expert as, as exaggerated. And I think that might be an interesting way to think about the climate science as well.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's something very interesting there, right, that I think is maybe worth camping out on for a second, is that this, the way the science is done, as in this way that we've covered, right, this kind of very mono-dimensional sort of way of thinking, leads the presentation of that science to the public to look very monodimensional as well, and it makes it look like it's kind of not a solved problem, but it looks like it's all tied up. It's like, oh, it's carbon dioxide. We know it makes it feel unproblematic in a way that maybe on one hand makes it sort of easier to ignore, and on the other hand makes it easier to just sort of attach the climate stuff to an infrastructure bill and just put it in front of Congress and just call it a done deal. That sort of stuff, right? That the lack of resolution and dimensionality to the thought that feeds into the science is reflected in a kind of lack of dimensionality to the thought that contemplates the science afterwards, and in the social sphere, right? It's because we're all sort of wondering how is it that this massive problem has gotten so little traction, or is only now starting to build traction? And I think that might be a partial sort of explanation for it, is that, I don't know, there's a lack, just a sort of dearth of detail and ontological sort of honesty in the whole thing.
Oh, I was just going to say that, that there is some developing activism around it, where you've got, civil society groups I used to call it the ETC group, but it's actually the Etc. group, which is an environmental organization that does kind of massive critiques of climate science in this similar vein. Where they've actually got on part of their website an update on events in geoengineering and things that are kind of going on in different media and everything. There's also people like Clive Hamilton, who's a professor in Australia that's got a kind of more popular book critiquing geoengineering, but also Science for the People. I mentioned before we started last year, because they did a relaunch, and last year they did a special issue on geoengineering rooted in kind of more socialist Marxist approaches to science and climate change, where they talk about environmental capitalism and dispossession and consensus formation in a kind of more popular way, engaging the public in a more kind of more Marxist, socially driven way.
Yeah. I think that could definitely be fruitful in a similar way to some kind of revival of mass politics being necessary in this period in order to kind of overwhelm the barriers to action within the state and within sort of the whole apparatus of lobbying and campaign finance and all that kind of stuff. That we can talk about ontological plurality until we're blue in the face, but we also have to acknowledge that there have been massive campaigns of disinformation, information suppression, bribery, all these kinds of things. There have been enormous crimes against humanity that have been committed that are very, straightforward. And these things they don't cancel each other out. They're both true, right?
And it's really interesting that, some of the biggest advocates of this form of geoengineering are, those think tanks and actors that, just yesterday were climate deniers.
Right.
Like the American Enterprise Institute, Hudson Heartland Institute, that their support of it fits with this kind of mastery over nature ethos. And it's a way to, potentially make money. And it also allows for, continued high consumption and extractive economies, right? So it's this justifies a delay in making any kind of structural changes.
Yeah, I think it really echoes for me the way in which the big business, large capitalist firms were able in, I think it was the 70s and 80s, to successfully download the responsibility for recycling onto consumers, so as to just not really shake things up at all, maintain profitability as much as they possibly could, offload costs to the public sector, offload costs to individuals, anything to just kind of keep business as usual, the same old crap, as Marx would say, going.
Yeah, and I think it's in keeping also with that individualizing of responsibility. It fits with that neoliberal ethos of making responsible the individual for actions that are structural in nature is not going to do much to change anything.
Yeah, and I think one point that you brought up that did seem very relevant to these kind of social conversations about science was, I think this might have been something you took from Longino, but this idea of the knower being social, not the individual. And I think part of the sort of climate denialism activity that is exercised by sort of lay scientists, right, like members of the public who are climate deniers and who sort of read climate denier literature and educate themselves in it, is that they have this very individualistic concept of knowing that kind of echoes back to like older kind of understandings of science, and bringing in that idea of the social knower, I think could really help to kind of dissolve that sort of very like masculinist, individualist understanding of knowledge and of science.
Yeah, I actually, and that's in keeping with a long line of feminist science, which, is looking, that sort of great man theory of science, where you have like a genius scientist in a lab doing all the work, where it turns out in a lot of, rethinking of scientific history, you have, assistants that actually did most of the work. You've got, women who transcribed everything. You've got, a lot of different marginalized groups involved in the process of science, sometimes as the objects of scientific experimentation that are written out of the history. And that ethos of the individual, that kind of very pernicious neoliberal construct is sort of the source of a lot of the ways that the sciences have become distorted. And that's what I like about Longino, is that she talks about how scientific truth it's this consensus-based model in scientific communities.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely goes back to like the interwar sort of like Neurath style philosophy of science as well. Like there's an origin for this in the socialist movement as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we wrap up, Tina?
There was just one, other for listeners, if they want to keep their eye out from, there's a test of the solar radiation management geoengineering technique, which is supposed to take place, I think, in the southwest of the United States, maybe Arizona. It's scientist David Keith out of Harvard and a few collaborators. He's got sort of a geoengineering private company, and he does a lot of academic research. He's gotten a little bit of funding from Bill Gates as well, of what's called ScopeX, which is Stratospheric Controlled Perturbation Experiment. And their plan is to launch a balloon 20 kilometers above the Earth and release a small amount of calcium carbonate, and then observe how the particles disperse and whether and if they reflect sunlight. One of the things that they're trying to do and potentially rolling out climate engineering is to find particulates that would be long lasting and that would lead to a lot of reflection over long periods. So that was one thing that has been in the works, and the other one was a recently in Kenya. there was a meeting on the UN Environmental Assembly, UNEA. They met in Switzerland, actually tabled a draft resolution on geoengineering governance, and they wanted to get the committee, the assembly, to produce a report on future geoengineering governance. It was supported by Niger, New Zealand, Mexico, Mali, but it was blocked by the US and Saudi Arabia, as well as Brazil. And the sensible reason was that it was due to fossil fuel and logging interests, who didn't want. What was interesting was that a lot of the fossil fuel companies, you might think that, okay, they would want to kind of talk about it and lead the discussions, but there was this underlying argument that they wanted to both continue admitting as long as possible, and they didn't want international regulation of new technologies.
Yeah, so look out for apocalyptic headlines coming your way soon, as soon as that test starts. I wonder if this is how, that film The Road, and it's a book as well, but that mysterious apocalypse that wipes out all life. I wonder if this is it, it's a geoengineering experiment. We'll find out pretty soon. Thanks, Tina, for joining us. It has been a wonderful conversation. We should have you back on again to talk about any old thing. And thanks, listeners, for coming along with us on this one too. If you want to catch up with the show, you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook as General Intellect Unit. And you can catch us on all the podcast apps, subscribe, share us with your friends, all that sort of stuff. Or you can go to patreon.com/General Intellect Unit to support us. Throw us a couple of bucks a month, helps to pay for books and stuff. And depending on how the edit turns out for this show, I'm starting to realize I might need to get a new computer because the fans on this one are going crazy, and I think they'll show up in the recording. So pay for that too. And also you can check out our sister shows at emancipation.network on the web. There's a couple of cool shows on there, Swampside Chats and From Alpha to Omega. They're good people and they're good shows. So check them out. And, guests get the last word. So, Tina, where can people find your work?
Well, you can go to my Newcastle University sort of staff profile that has, a lot of my publications. So I've got an academia.edu account. I'm on Twitter at Tsikka, Tsikka, and on Facebook under Tina Sikka as well.
Superb. Thanks very much again, and thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.